Ever get the feeling that the system that's supposed to, process immigrants, help them find a better life, might actually be making things harder? Today, we're diving deep, going way back into the history of immigrant detention in the U.S.
Okay, sounds interesting.
Yeah, and we've got this book, In the Shadow of Liberty, by Raquel Minian. She really gets into it, lays out the history, but also, the human stories,
Oh, so it's not just like dry facts and figures.
Not at all. It's powerful stuff.
Wow, okay. And what time period are we talking about here?
Minion takes us all the way from the late 1800s, so think like Chinese Exclusion Act era,
Yep, right.
up to today with, everything happening at the border. It's a pretty wide scope.
Yeah, it is. Wow, and she uses like personal stories to kind of bring it to life?
Yeah, she focuses on the experiences of four individuals in particular.
Okay.
Their stories are woven throughout the book. So, even though we're talking about different time periods, different policies, there's this thread, this connection that runs through it all.
That's fascinating. So who are these four people? What makes their story so important?
Okay, so first we've got Chi Hao. He was a Chinese student who was detained on Angel Island back in 1901.
1901.
Yeah, and here's the kicker. He actually had the proper documentation.
Wow.
But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, he ended up, stuck.
It's crazy how, even back then, having your papers in order wasn't always enough.
Yeah, it's eye-opening. Then, fast forward a few decades, we've got Ellen Knopf. She arrived in the U.S. in 1948, right after World War II.
Okay.
She was German, and here's the thing, she was married to a U.S. citizen.
Oh, wow.
But she gets caught up in the whole Red Scare, Cold War paranoia.
Right.
They labeled her a security threat.
Wow, no way.
Yeah. Then we jump to 1980, the Mariel boat lift. Remember that? Thousands of Cubans fleeing to the U.S.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So we meet Gerardo Mansour. He came over during the boat lift, was initially welcomed, but then things take a turn. And lastly, bringing us to more recent times, we have Fernando. He's a Guatemalan father who fled to the U.S. with his family in 2018, trying to escape gang violence.
Oh, gosh. That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and they get caught up in the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy.
It's amazing to me how these stories, even though they're from such different times and circumstances, they all touch on this one system. It really makes you think about, the bigger picture.
Exactly, and that's what Minian does so well. She uses these individual stories to highlight these recurring themes in U.S. immigration, throughout history.
Like what?
Well, for one, that line between legal and illegal immigration, it's not always so clear-cut.
Yeah, you can see that even in just the few stories you've mentioned.
Right, Chi Hao with his documentation, Ellen Knopf married to a citizen, and then there's the role of fear and prejudice in shaping policy.
Absolutely, that's a big one.
How fear often trumps logic, even compassion. And then, of course, there's the human cost. Minian doesn't shy away from showing the devastating impact of detention, especially on families, on children.
Yeah, you can't even imagine.
And those themes, they echo throughout the entire book, throughout history, really.
Wow. It's almost like, are we really making progress, or are we just repeating the same mistakes over and over again?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that Minian really forces us to confront. But let's unpack these themes a bit further. Starting with Chi Hao. He's detained on Angel Island, right?
Right.
Early 1900s, the Chinese Exclusion Act is in full effect. What was life actually like for him in detention, and how does that connect to this whole idea of fear and prejudice shaping policy?
So Chi Hao's experience, it's a really stark example of how prejudice can actually become policy, and then have these really awful consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act itself, back in 1882,
Right.
was fueled by this racist fear of Chinese immigrants. People were afraid they were taking jobs, disrupting society, all of that.
Right.
So this law basically bars Chinese laborers from even entering the country. And then you've got people like Chi Hao, who, even though he's a student, even though he has his documents, he gets caught up in this web of suspicion and fear.
So even though he's technically supposed to be allowed in.
Exactly. And what happens? Grueling interrogations, terrible conditions, denied basic rights, all because he's Chinese.
It's hard to fathom that happening in a country that's supposed to be a beacon of freedom and opportunity,
I know, right?
And Minian actually quotes Chi Hao in the book. He talks about how shocked he was by the way he was treated. He even says something like, how could this happen in the country which had sent their beloved pastors and teachers to China?
It's that hypocrisy, that dissonance between the image and the reality.
Exactly, and Minian really drives that point home. you know? She contrasts this idealized image of America, this land of opportunity, with the harsh reality that people like Chi Hao faced.
And you can't forget about the fire.
The fire.
Yeah, on Angel Island. Back in 1910, a huge fire ripped through the place, destroyed tons of records. And it left this lingering sense of vulnerability, of fear. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's this dark cloud hanging over everything.
So you've got this fear, you've got this rampant anti-Chinese sentiment, and it all comes together to create this incredibly hostile, dehumanizing environment.
Exactly.
So we start to see how fear, prejudice, this image of America, how it all intersects to shape the experience of immigrants like Chi Hao in the early 20th century. But this system, with its roots in that era, it doesn't just disappear, does it? How does it evolve over time? Where do we go from Angel Island?
Well, the system, it kind of like adapts, it expands. And a lot of times it's in response to new anxieties, new perceived threats.
And that's where Ellen Off's story comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're jumping ahead a few decades now to the post-World War II era. And the anxieties are shifting. Now it's about communism, about national security.
Yeah.
And that's going to have a big impact on how the immigration system works.
And that whole idea you're talking about earlier about the line between legal and illegal immigration becoming blurred, it really comes into play here with Ellen's story.
Totally.
Because here you have this woman, a German immigrant, but she's legally married to an American citizen, yet she still gets detained when she arrives at Ellis Island.
Well, crazy.
It's like something out of a Kafka novel.
The trial.
Right.
Yes. Individuals punished without explanation, just stuck in this bureaucratic nightmare.
Exactly. Minian even makes that connection in the book, that Kafka-esque element.
Yeah.
And it's so fitting because Ellen's detention dragged on for over 3 years.
3 years.
3 years. And it all stemmed from McCarthyism, that second Red Scare. The government, they labeled her a security threat, but they wouldn't say why.
Right. They refused to give her any real explanation. They wouldn't give her a fair hearing. Nothing. Can you imagine? You arrive in this new country, you're ready to start a family, build a life, and suddenly you're accused of being a threat to national security. And you have absolutely no idea why.
It's chilling. It really makes you realize how easily our rights can be, trampled on in the name of security, especially when there's this climate of fear and paranoia.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, Ellen's story is just one example of how that's played out in U.S. history.
Her case, it must have had a lasting impact, right? I mean, it did change something about the system, didn't it?
That's the question, isn't it? We like to think that we learn from our mistakes, that things get better over time. And in some ways, Ellen's case did help shine a light on some of the injustices within the system.
So there was some progress.
There was some progress. Public outcry over her detention, along with some other similar cases, it did eventually lead to a shift. The government started using parole more often as an alternative to these prolonged detentions, especially for people who had family in the U.S.,
So it's like some steps forward. But as you kind of hinted at earlier, progress isn't always linear, is it?
No, not at all. It's more like this 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of dance.
And that brings us to the 1980s, right? The Mariel boat lift, Gerardo Mansur's story. So how did that event, this massive exodus of Cubans fleeing to the U.S., how did that reshape the landscape of immigrant detention?
The Mariel boat lift, it's a real turning point in Minian's narrative.
Yeah.
Because that's when we see all these different factors kind of collide. And it ends up pushing the U.S. towards this much more punitive approach to immigration.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. You've got this huge influx of refugees, right?
Right, and that always seems to trigger anxiety, doesn't it? No matter where you are in the world.
Exactly. People get scared. They start worrying about resources, about their way of life changing.
Right.
But on top of that, you also have the rise of mass incarceration happening in the U.S. at the same time.
Yeah.
And that disproportionately impacts communities of color, right? So you've got this perfect storm brewing. It creates this context where it becomes very easy politically to link immigration with crime.
Even if the statistics don't back it up.
Exactly. And that's where someone like Gerardo Mansur gets caught in the gears of this system.
Even though initially he was welcomed into the U.S. as part of this wave of Cuban refugees.
Right. And that's what Minian uses his story to show us. How easily someone can go from being a welcomed refugee to being labeled a deportable criminal. Especially in a system that's so laser-focused on enforcement and deterrence.
So wait, what happened? He gets into trouble.
Well, Gerardo builds a life here, right? He's working, he has a family, but then he gets caught for a minor offense and boom, suddenly he's facing deportation.
Oh, no.
Separated from his loved ones, his whole life turned upside down.
It's heartbreaking. And it reminds me of that central theme that Minian keeps coming back to, the devastating impact of family separation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that theme, it comes through even more powerfully in the final story she chronicles, the story of Fernando and his family. They were fleeing gang violence in Guatemala.
Right, in 2018, so much more recently.
Yeah, and their experience under the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy, it really brings the human cost of detention into sharp focus.
Because, I mean, what happened to Fernando and his family, it was awful.
It was. And tragically, it wasn't an isolated incident, that zero-tolerance policy. It resulted in thousands of families being torn apart at the U.S.-Mexico border. Thousands. Parents, often fleeing incredibly dangerous situations, seeking asylum. They were detained and prosecuted for crossing the border illegally. And their children, they were put in separate facilities, sometimes thousands of miles away.
It's just, I can't even fathom the trauma of that experience, both for the parents and the children. It's just inhumane.
Exactly. And Minian, she doesn't hold back at her criticism of the zero-tolerance policy. She calls it a direct assault on families, a moral stain on the nation.
And she's right. It's just wrong on every level.
But she also does something really interesting. She connects it back to this larger history of detention that we've been discussing.
How so?
She argues that zero tolerance wasn't some kind of anomaly. It wasn't just Trump. She says it was the culmination of decades of increasingly harsh policies.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's like she's saying we didn't just wake up one day and decide to separate families at the border. This has been building for years.
Wow. So this whole for-profit prison system, this increasing reliance on detention as a first resort, the political rhetoric demonizing immigrants, it all contributed to creating an environment where separating families at the border was seen as, I don't know, acceptable.
Right. Or even necessary.
It's a chilling thought, really, that these policies, these decisions are often driven not by logic, not by compassion, but by this desire to punish.
Deterrence through punishment.
Exactly, and it doesn't matter who gets hurt in the process.
And that's what makes this book, this whole conversation, so incredibly important.
Because we can't begin to address a problem until we understand how deep it runs, right?
Exactly. We have to understand the history, the forces that have shaped the system we have today, if we ever want to change it.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and it's heavy stuff. But before we move on, I want to take a moment to just, reflect on the stories of these four individuals.
Yeah.
Chi Hao, Ellen Knopf, Gerardo Mansour, Fernando. Their stories are all so different, yet they all seem to reveal something very unsettling about the way we treat immigrants in this country.
That's the power of Minian's book, I think. She takes these individual stories, these individual lives, and she uses them to hold up a mirror to us as a nation.
And the reflection isn't always pretty.
No, it's not. But that's why we need to look, why we need to pay attention. Because only then can we even begin to imagine a different way forward.
We're back, and wow, those stories really stick with you.
They do, don't they? It's easy to get caught up in the abstract, the policies, the numbers, but when you hear those individual stories, it really hits home.
It does, and like we were talking about before the break, Ellen Knopf's case, it just feels so unjust. I mean, being detained for 3 years, denied a fair hearing, all because of these vague accusations, it just, it feels like a nightmare. Did her case have any lasting impact? Did it change anything about the system?
It's interesting because her case ended up becoming kind of a flashpoint. I mean, think about it, post-war America, this whole idea of the American dream, and here you have this woman married to a citizen being treated like a criminal.
Exactly.
So yeah, it did have an impact, though
Yeah.
maybe not in the way she would have hoped. I mean, she was eventually deported, but her case, along with a few others, it really put a spotlight on the injustices of the system. And it contributed to a growing movement calling for reform.
So some progress, but as you've alluded to before, progress can be fragile. Which brings us to the 1980s, the Mariel boat lift, and Gerardo Mansour's story. How did this event, which saw thousands of Cubans fleeing to the U.S., reshape the landscape of immigrant detention?
Oh, the Mariel boat lift. Now that's a really complex chapter.
Yeah.
Because on one hand, you have this outpouring of sympathy, right? People fleeing communism, risking their lives for freedom. But on the other hand, you have this undercurrent of fear, of anxiety about this mass arrival of people. And it doesn't help that it's happening against the backdrop of a struggling economy and this whole tough-on-crime rhetoric that was gaining traction.
Right, and that's where we see this shift towards a more punitive approach to immigration, right?
Exactly. And it's not just about the number of people coming in, it's also about who they are. Remember, this is the 1980s, the height of the war on drugs, and there were these, frankly, racist stereotypes about Cubans being criminals, drug dealers, even though most of the people coming over during the boat lift were just ordinary families looking for a better life.
So Gerardo and his family, they get caught up in this system, even though they were initially welcomed into the U.S. What happened?
Well, like so many others, Gerardo gets caught in this web of suspicion and fear. He's trying to build a life here, working, raising his family, but he gets in trouble with the law. A minor offense, nothing serious. But because of his immigration status, because of this new climate of fear, it's enough to trigger deportation proceedings.
Oh my gosh, it's just heartbreaking. It's like one misstep and your whole life can be turned upside down.
Exactly. And it's not just his life, right? It's his family's life too. His children are American citizens, but they're facing the possibility of losing their father, of being uprooted from their home, their community.
It's a reminder that these policies, they don't just impact individuals, they tear families apart, and they leave lasting scars on entire communities.
Absolutely. And that brings us to Fernando's story, which unfortunately shows us that these same patterns of fear, prejudice, and punitive policies, they continue to play out even today. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy might be the most recent example, but as Minian argues, it's part of a much longer history.
A history that, sadly, doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. But we'll delve into that more and explore potential solutions after a quick break. Stay with us. We're back, and it's easy to get caught up in the human toll of this system, the stories we've been hearing about.
Right.
But there's another side to this, isn't there? The financial cost, the ethical implications.
Absolutely. And Minian, she doesn't shy away from those questions at all.
No, she doesn't. And what she reveals is pretty startling, honestly.
It is.
Yeah.
When you start looking at the numbers, it's kind of mind-blowing.
So, what are we talking about here? Give us the rundown.
Well, for starters, detention is incredibly expensive.
Okay, that makes sense, I guess. You gotta house people, feed them, provide security.
Right, but it goes way beyond that. You've got transportation costs, legal fees, administrative overhead. It all adds up.
So how much are we talking about? Do we even know?
Well, in 2018 alone, the U.S. government spent over $7 billion on immigration detention. Just detention.
$7 billion.
$7 billion.
That's unfathomable. And to think, that's just 1 year.
Exactly. And it's a figure that's been steadily rising over the past few decades.
So where is all that money going?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated and, frankly, more disturbing. Because a significant chunk of that money, it's not even going to government agencies. It's going to private companies.
Private companies? Wait, you're saying that immigrant detention is being outsourced to for-profit businesses?
In a nutshell, yes.
Yeah.
It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
So it's like we've created this system where we're literally profiting from locking people up, many of whom, let's not forget, are fleeing violence and persecution.
That's the irony, isn't it? The very people we should be helping, we're instead locking up and then paying someone else to profit from their detention.
It's morally bankrupt, and it creates this vicious cycle, doesn't it? The more people we detain, the more money these private companies make, the more political power they gain to lobby for even more detention.
Exactly. It's what Minian calls the detention industrial complex.
Right, like the military-industrial complex, but for immigration.
Precisely. And it creates these perverse incentives where the focus shifts from actually addressing the root cause of migration to simply maximizing detention, regardless of the human cost.
So we've got this system that's morally questionable, it's incredibly expensive, and as you've pointed out before, it's not even clear that it's effective as a deterrent.
Right, because people fleeing desperate situations, they're often willing to risk detention if it means even a slim chance at a better life.
So the question then becomes, if detention is so clearly flawed, why does it persist? What are the arguments used to justify it, and how does Minian respond to those arguments?
Well, one of the most common arguments is that detention is necessary for deterrence. Like we were just talking about, the idea is that if people know they'll be detained, they'll be less likely to try to come here illegally.
Right, but you're saying that the evidence doesn't really support that claim.
Exactly. Minian points to studies that show that detention is not an effective deterrent. especially for people fleeing violence and persecution, which, let's be honest, describes a lot of the people seeking asylum in the U.S.
If deterrence isn't really the goal, then what is? What's really driving this insistence on detention?
Well, Minian argues that it's often driven by political expediency. It's about appealing to voters' fears, appearing tough on immigration, even if it means sacrificing our values in the process.
So instead of looking for real solutions, we fall back on these punitive measures that might make us feel safer, but don't actually address the underlying issues.
And often make them worse.
Exactly. Because when we treat immigrants like criminals, when we create this climate of fear and suspicion, it makes it that much harder for them to integrate into society, to build a better life for themselves and their families.
It's counterproductive on every level. And it's a betrayal of our own history as a nation built by immigrants.
It's like we've lost sight of that somehow. We've allowed fear to distort our vision, to cloud our judgment.
In Minian's book, it's a powerful call to wake up, to remember who we are and what we stand for.
So if we're going to move beyond this system of detention, what are the alternatives? What does a more humane, a more effective approach to immigration look like?
Well, Minian points to several promising models. Things like community-based case management, where individuals and families are provided with support and resources to help them navigate the system while living in the community.
So instead of locking them up, we give them the support they need to rebuild their lives.
Exactly. And studies have shown that this approach can be both more effective and more cost-effective than detention.
It just makes sense, doesn't it? Treat people with dignity, give them the tools they need to succeed, and they're more likely to thrive.
It's not rocket science. And Minian also emphasizes the importance of legal representation. Having access to a lawyer can make all the difference in navigating the complexities of immigration law.
Especially in a system that's designed to be so difficult to navigate.
Exactly. It's about leveling the playing field, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, have access to justice.
So access to legal counsel, community support, a focus on integration rather than detention. These are all part of a more humane, a more effective approach to immigration.
And it's an approach that Minian believes is not only possible, but essential if we want to uphold our values as a nation.
This deep dive into In the Shadow of Liberty has been a difficult but necessary conversation. We've confronted some uncomfortable truths about our history, about the choices we've made, and the consequences of those choices.
But it's also been a conversation about hope, about the possibility of creating a better, more just future for everyone.
A future where we treat all people with dignity and respect, regardless of where they come from or how they got here.
A future where we recognize that immigration is not a threat, but a source of strength, of vitality, of renewal.
And that's a future worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and a huge thank you to Raquel Minian for her incredible work in bringing this often invisible history to light. We hope this conversation inspires you to learn more, to get involved, and to be part of the solution.